Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to our education series webinar for today from VOYCE. It's a professional and community education series webinar, and today's topic is cannabis and CBD for older adults and long-term care residents. My name is Jamie McGeechan. I'm the Events and Sponsorship Coordinator at VOYCE, and we're very glad to have you. Thank you to our sponsors for the education series. We are grateful for their support. If you've forgotten to opt in to our sponsor prize drawing, please email your name to events@voicestl.org to enter. Your information will be shared with our generous sponsors. A special thanks to the Missouri Healthcare Association for facilitating nursing home administrator CEUs. And please take a moment to complete the survey at the end of the webinar. We are grateful for everyone's feedback, community guests and our professional guests, and we require your feedback for the CEU processing. So please do fill in the survey at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Upcoming education from VOYCE. Professional education on October 26th, we have a session advancing LGBTQ long-term care equality in your community, presented by Dan Stewart from the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. November 9th, protecting your hard-earned financial assets with Laurie Peterson-Sakai. And December 7th, it's a community education and professional education webinar, Managing Survivor's Guilt During COVID-19. And on to our presenters for today, who we are very grateful to have. We have Eric Walter, partner at Armstrong, Teasdale, General Counsel, Missouri Cannabis Trade Association, and Dr. Patricia Hurford, SOAR Medical, Executive Board Member at Missouri Cannabis Trade Association. And without too much more ado, I will introduce Dr. Patricia Hurford. Good afternoon, Patricia. Good afternoon.
Hello. Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you.
All right. You see my slides there?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the medical aspects of cannabis, particularly as it applies to older adults and long-term care residents. So before we get started, cannabis is considered a Schedule I drug, and I know Eric will discuss this in a little bit more detail, but basically a Schedule I drug means that it has no known medical use and has a high potential for abuse. And this does have some ramifications on the use of cannabis on a state level. In addition, there are restrictions in the way that cannabis can be studied as a medicine or a medicinal agent. So this presentation today is just a guide. I put this together to introduce you to cannabis from the cannabis plant from a medicinal standpoint, just to give you a quick overview. If you want any more information regarding the laws of Missouri, I'm going to refer you back to those laws, and you can access much of this information from the Department of Health and Senior Services. The first few slides here, just to go over certain terms and the history of cannabis as a medicinal agent. Cannabis itself is just a type of flower. It's indigenous in Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Hemp is actually a cannabis plant that contains less than 0.3% of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, which is the more psychoactive component of a general cannabis plant. An endocannabinoid is a biological system that we all have in our bodies. Endocannabinoids are natural chemicals or molecules in our body, and phytocannabinoids are those that come from the plant, the cannabis plant. The terms indica and sativa are going out of favor, but indica tends to mean a more sedating type of effect from cannabis plant, sativa being more invigorating. And entourage is the ability of the different components of the cannabis plant, including the phytocannabinoids, the flavorable parts of the plants or terpenes, and the aromas and oils of the plant to actually work together and have a higher effect or better effect when combined in smaller quantities than it may be in isolation of any of those components. So cannabis has been around forever. There's evidence of cannabis being used as an anesthetic as far back as 400 in BC. And the first documented use of cannabis as a medicine was in 2700 BC. Throughout the 1600s, the hemp plant was used industrially throughout Europe. And by the 1800s, it was being used as a very rigorous and important product in the United States, which becomes important when we get into the politics of what happened to cannabis and its legalization and its scheduling as a Schedule I drug. But early in the 19th and 20th centuries, cannabis was used by many physicians as a medical therapy. And in fact, the US Pharmacopoeia, which is a book listing all the medicines that were used, including medicinal agents from plants, cannabis was listed in there. And that stayed in that book until 1942. But starting in 1937, a tax act was put into place, and it restricted the use and prescription or advisement of cannabis use to patients. And it also restricted pharmacists from dispensing cannabis products. And they did this, it was basically a way to minimize cannabis use throughout the population. At one point in 1942, the only argument against removing cannabis as a useful medical product came from the American Medical Association, which really intended to keep cannabis in place. In 1970s, under Richard Nixon, the Controlled Substance Act came about, and cannabis was rescheduled as a Schedule I drug, again, implying that it had no medicinal use and was highly addictive, or potentially highly addictive and prone to abuse. By 1996, California became the first state to legalize cannabis for medical use. In November of 2019, Amendment 2 in Missouri passed. And basically, this amendment said that Missourians could now have access to cannabis as a medicinal agent in the state of Missouri. This was overwhelmingly supported by Missourians. It created, through the Department of Health and Senior Services, regulations and licensing practices to put into place how cannabis would be grown, manufactured, dispensed, and who could access that. A 4% retail tax would then go to veterans care initiatives to support health and well-being of veterans in the state of Missouri. And just recently, the state delivered a $6.8 million check to the Veterans Association in Missouri. So in November 6, 2018, Amendment 2 was adopted, and it became effective in December of 2018. The first accepted applications by patients for access to medical cannabis occurred in July of 2019. The role of a physician in identifying patients who are appropriate for cannabis use is really, number one, advocate for the patient. We want to help people, and if the plant can be useful in treating their medical condition, that should be first and foremost part of the physician's role. They should also identify if the plant would be risky or dangerous to a patient. So physicians don't prescribe cannabis. They certify patients that they have indeed a qualifying condition that has been identified and is outlined in the Missouri Constitution as being a condition that would warrant or be amenable to the use of cannabis. Ideally, the patients and the physicians would go back and forth if they experience side effects with cannabis or they have any questions about the use of the product, that they would go back to their physician. Physicians and people who work in the cannabis industry in Missouri are protected from liability. What are those qualifying conditions? Well, number one is cancer. The second one, and many of you have probably heard of these conditions, epilepsy or seizure disorders, glaucoma, intractable migraines that haven't responded to other treatments, any chronic medical condition that results in muscle spasms or persistent, long, ongoing neurologic dysfunction, including seizures, would be in this category. MS or multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and Tourette's syndrome also fall into this category. Any debilitating disorder that's psychiatric, as long as it's diagnosed by a psychiatrist, including post-traumatic stress disorder, is another qualifying condition. HIV or AIDS are both qualifying conditions in the state of Missouri. The eighth category is probably the most commonly used category for certifying patients. And this says any medical condition, which is chronic, that when treated with prescription medications could lead to physical or psychological dependence on those medications, and in which the physician decides that or determines that the patient has a condition that would warrant the use of cannabis in place of those other medications. This category clearly is identifying pain or chronic pain disorders where opioids or other dangerous medicines could be used. Then that would be an alternative treatment and qualifies patients for cannabis use. Any terminal illness. And this last category is more general. If a physician determines that a patient has a chronic debilitating or other medical condition, such as hepatitis C or Alzheimer's or other neurocognitive disorders, then those may indeed be qualifying conditions as well. So how does a patient go about receiving a cannabis certification? First, they must meet with a physician. The physician will review their medical records. And once they determine that they have a qualifying condition, the physician will sign an electronic document, and then the patient will complete their own portion of that electronic document. So the patient will wait a short period of time, allowing the physician to complete that document. And they have 30 days after the physician's signature to complete their portion and submit it to the Department of Health and Senior Services. This is a certification instruction form I give to patients, and it shows them, it walks them through the application process. And on the department's website are video tutorials to help patients who may be a little bit more uncomfortable with that process. The state has 30 days to respond to certification documentation, and usually their response is within 7 to 14 days. There are some items that you have to include in the documentation process. That would include a photocopy of a driver's license or another identifying document with your picture on it, a current photo, and something to demonstrate that you are a resident of the state of Missouri. Those documents and certifications are only good for the state of Missouri. You can't take them across the state line to use in another medical marijuana state. The cannabis industry is interesting. And so the cultivation process is actually how cannabis plants are grown. So there are cultivation centers that have basically huge gardens. And that's where the plant is grown, it's harvested, it's cured, and then it's sent off to a manufacturing facility. The manufacturing facilities will then extract certain parts of the plant, grind it, blend it, and they prepare it into a product. So this could be an edible product, something you would eat, or it could be something that you could smoke. It could be a liquid or a topical agent. The dispensaries are the actual storefronts, if you will, that you can obtain cannabis products. So the patients would have access only to these dispensaries where they would meet with experts who should understand the medical treatment of their condition. These are called bud tenders and help direct patients to the right type of product. Testing laboratories in the state of Missouri are to perform comprehensive testing of all the plants and products that come out. They identify what components of the plant are actually in the product, and they also will look for any physical or microbial contamination to any products to protect patients. They'll look at the potency of the product as well and confirm that it's accurate. And all those products that you find in dispensaries are labeled with information that should reflect that testing. So to give you a broad overview, there are now 36 states and the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands that allow medical use of cannabis. There are 11 states that allow basically CBD products. So they have low concentrations of THC and much higher CBD concentrations. And then there are 18 states where they have no medical cannabis use. There are a number of states that have recreational adult use cannabis. I'm specifically limiting this discussion to the medical uses of marijuana or cannabis. The endocannabinoid system I referenced earlier, this is a biological system that maintains homeostasis for people. So stress and appetite, immunity, sleep, all of those are part of our endocannabinoid system. And they did studies on mice, and they were able to alter that internal system that was there, and they could induce sleep disorders. They could induce eating disorders. They could induce cognitive disorders. They could induce immunity problems. They could also switch it and improve it with changing that endocannabinoid system. And much of that runner's high that we used to think came from endorphins is probably related to the endocannabinoid system and not from endorphins themselves. That system of endocannabinoids exists in everyone. If we can alter that either internally, and there are chemicals that are indigenous to our bodies, or alter it with an external product like the phytocannabinoids, then we can alter or change immunity, cognition, appetite, sleep, pain. And so this is what this chart is demonstrating. The endocannabinoid receptors are there. They have chemicals, either the ones we make ourselves that can hook into those receptors, or those that come from the plant itself. They'll hook onto those receptors again to affect that homeostasis in our bodies. There are multiple cannabinoids out there, well over 100, and there are other parts of the plant that become very important. So altogether in this small plant are probably 500 to 600 different components that can alter health or make changes in health. This slide just demonstrates the difference between those that are psychoactive, the ones that can make you feel a little funny and sleepy, or the non-psychoactive. The non-psychoactive cannabinoids would be CBD, CBG, and CBC. So CBD, we know, has an anti-inflammatory component. It also has a neuroprotective component. It can help with anxiety and stress. CBG also has an anti-inflammatory component and has been demonstrating some very nice improvements in treating Parkinson's disease, number one. And CBC is a newer one out there that has antibacterial and antifungal properties. On the other side are the psychoactive agents, THC, CBN, THCV, and those have different properties. So THC is very good with sleep disorders, pain treatment. CBN has a strong portion of the molecule that may be really helpful in treating chronic sleep conditions. The next is a cannabis wheel, and these are just 3 variations of ways to look at the plant and determine what products might be helpful for you. And they break them up onto the different phytocannabinoids and how they interact and what they may be beneficial for. So if you look at the one on the left, it has THC, all the different uses of THC. And if you combine it with CBD, you can get an entourage or improved effect and may cover different conditions. The next wheel looks at all of those and kind of brings them in. So CBD has a lot more effective uses and is combined with many of the other cannabinoids. The last wheel is interesting because they take different medical conditions. So cachexia, where you're not eating much, or nausea, or stomach problems, or anxiety, or sleep disorders. And then you can follow it out to determine what cannabinoids might be helpful for those conditions. So these are interesting. And there's a lot of overlap, and patients will respond to each of those differently. How can you use cannabis? You can inhale it. So just the leaf itself can be inhaled. It can be vaporized, so you have a liquid form and inhaled that way. The nice thing about an inhaled cannabis product is it has a very rapid onset. It also is eliminated from the body fairly rapidly. It's hard to determine or balance that effect with inhalation. And I would gather that most physicians don't recommend inhalation as a consumption method, or not very often. Probably the most common way, and the product that I would recommend the most for patients that has a relatively fast onset and duration of action of four hours or so, is a tincture, where you take the liquid product and place it under the tongue and it's absorbed. It bypasses some of that absorption that has to occur when you eat something. So the effects are noted more quickly. Edibles are products that you can eat. They last a long time. The problem with edibles is that their duration of effect, although it's long, is hard to predict when the onset of that effect might occur. And it oftentimes can be distorted by things you've eaten and other medications that you've used. It's hard to balance or determine what might be the right dose based on edible use. And the last option is topical. You can use most of these products in a lotion form. In older adults, the stigma of using cannabis has gone away. And in fact, articles from JAMA indicate the use of dramatically. The prevalence per year, and in the last study where they really looked at this, we've gone up from 2.4% in 2015 to 4.2% in 2018. And recent data suggests it's well over 6% in patients who are over the age of 65. So what can we use the cannabis plant for? And I'm not specifically talking about THC or CBD, but many of those in combination, those cannabinoids in combination. Pain is the number one treatment that patients will use cannabis products for. And that can be pain from nerves, pain from the brain or central nervous system, or peripheral pain from another problem. Sleep disorders also rank very high for patients who are using cannabis products when they're over the age of 65. Muscle spasticity or spasms, anxiety, cognition or thinking disorders. Cannabis has been used to help with addiction problems, sexual dysfunction, as I stated several times, Parkinson's disease, and even elevated cholesterol, just to name a few. Is cannabis safe? We don't recommend cannabis to pregnant women or breastfeeding women, not because there's data suggesting that it is dangerous in those populations. We just don't have enough data to say it's safe. If a patient has a history of a psychiatric disorder, then psychotic disorders can be intensified or worsened by the use of the cannabis plant. It can delay or limit and worsen short-term memory, as well as cognitive functioning. In an adult population, that tends to be very short-lived without any residual long-term consequences. In a younger person or adolescent who uses cannabis products, it can have long-lasting or permanent effects on cognition. There are some effects on the heart and lungs. typically with the inhaled products, and usually in a younger age group, interestingly enough. But the rapid heart rate that occurs in an older population can lead to myocardial or heart ischemia. So you get angina or chest pain, and in rare cases, heart attacks, which have not been directly linked to cannabis use, but may have an association. So cardiac problems should be reviewed before you determine whether a patient's an appropriate candidate for cannabis. But more important than that is how cannabis is used. So avoiding the inhaled or vaped forms of cannabis and using a different method of consumption. There are addictions to cannabis. They're not, you won't see overdoses of cannabis like you will with opioids. There are, and I'll cover this in a little bit more detail, drug interactions. And this is primarily with the CBD component and not the THC component. At high levels and higher doses of THC, anxiety, and even with CBD, anxiety can worsen. Panic attacks can happen. Lower dose products tend to avoid that and actually are helpful in treating anxiety and stress disorders. Just like any other medication that can alter mentation or the way you think, driving, operating heavy machinery should be avoided because you are impaired. And as I stated earlier, it can be, and there's a different set of risk factors with teenagers who use cannabis that need to be weighed when looking at whether or not cannabis would be an effective treatment for their condition. So specifically for seniors, medical cannabis is generally well tolerated. The most common side effects are dizziness, altered gait. So if a patient is at risk for falls, this should be considered. It can, particularly in the higher dose indica products or those with more THC, lead to more sleepiness and fatigue. Again, cardiac health and cannabis use should be considered, particularly if there are history of myocardial infarction or MIs, heart attacks, or any angina disorders. From a psychological standpoint and a cognition standpoint, cannabis has been used to help with Alzheimer's dementia and other neurocognitive dementias. There has to be a balance because in some cases, higher dose products may worsen that delirium that can be seen. And there is a lot of research being done in this area right now. Medical and medication interactions. As I stated earlier, there are at least 600 different chemicals in this plant. The two most active compounds have been looked at and studied. And of those two, THC and CBD, CBD has more drug interactions. The products themselves, those compounds can inhibit the use or effectiveness of some medicines, and they can also intensify the effect of other medications. So I've listed just a few to be particularly cautious with. So patients who are on Coumadin or warfarin, there are legitimate concerns, and that should be discussed with their physician. Other medications like amiodarone, which is used for heart rhythm abnormalities, can be affected by the use of cannabis products. Seizure medications often are affected by the use of CBD and thyroid medications. Beyond that, most of the interactions are fairly mild or of limited consequence to the treatment of other conditions. So my recommendations to patients: talk to your healthcare provider, have a physician that you're comfortable speaking with about some of these, or at least somebody who's eligible. And there are great nurses out there who devote their time helping patients find the right cannabis product to treat their condition in a way that's safer for them than many of the pharmacologic agents we have out there. Patients should know their body, know their level of health, and make informed decisions about that. Be educated. There's so many great resources out there. Most of the bad effects of cannabis are dose related. And so the general consensus among healthcare providers, start low dose, and go slow as you increase it to find the right dose for you. And this is called microdosing. I think we're going to save questions for the end. And I'm going to turn this over to my friend and a very knowledgeable gentleman, Eric Walter.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Hurford. That was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure our attendees will have a lot of questions, but we'll save them until the end. And it's been fantastic to learn about the physiological effects of cannabis, but of course, the legal side, the legalities in the application of cannabis and CBD is, of course, so important. So I'd like to introduce Eric Walter of Armstrong, Teasdale, to talk more about that. Good afternoon, Eric.
Eric, you're muted.
Off to a rousing start by forgetting to unmute myself. Jamie, thank you for the introduction. And Trish, great job. I'm going to share my slide deck. Can everyone see that all right?
Perfect.
All right, looks right. Okay. So I'm going to try to cover legal considerations. I'm going to touch on a few of the medical aspects that Trish covered, but I'm going to try to stay away from all that and not double up on anything. So we'll start with my favorite piece, the map. Trish had a map in her slides as well. And, so green is medical, orange is recreational, and these gray states, most of them also offer at least a low dose low dose CBD type solution. There's really only 3 states that say there is no benefit whatsoever having marijuana. So why is marijuana illegal to begin with? Trish covered some of this, but the history is a sort of tale. It would take far longer than a lot of time to cover, but it's a combination of racism and lack of knowledge and politics, and it led to this guy in the 1930s. This guy is sort of the arch enemy of marijuana. At that time, he needed something to do. He needed to justify his existence. It's Harry Anslinger. So he leads the charge towards that 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, and he's putting out these wonderful and enlightened messages to the world, which I guess at this time you could say these kind of things and then not later be standing in front of a podium explaining why you're resigning your job. So he's saying these different things, and he's helping to promote these concepts using this kind of propaganda information. And it's interesting as you go around to modern facilities now in the industry, and some of them will have these types of things as posters on their wall, as sort of a ironic celebration of the history of the industry. And so this 37 Tax Act comes around, and Trish mentioned it was replaced by the Controlled Substances Act, which we'll talk about in a minute. The backstory of why we went from that Tax Act to this is the Tax Act basically said if you are using marijuana, it's okay. We can't prohibit it at the federal level, or at least at that time they thought that they couldn't. That belief has evolved now. The federal government does think it can regulate marijuana even if it's just a state-specific operation. They've interpreted the Commerce Clause broadly, but at that time, they were regulating it through taxation. And the Supreme Court, through this Leary case, and the backstory is not that important, but the bottom line, he says, okay, on the one hand, under federal law, I'm supposed to report that I'm using this marijuana and pay the necessary taxes. But on the other hand, if I report that, I'm violating Texas state law, which prohibits the use of marijuana. And so I'm having to incriminate myself. So the Supreme Court strikes it down. Now, this is 1969, 1970. At that time, Congress could get something done besides, naming a post office. They could actually pass laws, they could regulate things, and so they did. And so in fairly short order, they passed this comprehensive Drug Abuse Control Act, and they put the Controlled Substances Act right in the heart of it. And there's multiple schedules, and they're based on abuse, medical use, and the safe use under medical supervision. Marijuana is on Schedule 1, right next to heroin, and ecstasy and peyote, those types of drugs, which again, 47 states say there's a medical benefit to it, but Schedule 1 is only for drugs that have no medical benefit whatsoever. Schedule 2, by example, cocaine, morphine, these are things that are better than marijuana, according to the federal government's scheduling. So you have to ask yourself, why is it on Schedule 1? It doesn't make any sense. When they were coming up with these schedules and they were trying to sort of, like you kick pick players to be on your kickball team or not, they had to figure out which ones go on which schedule. And I'd like to assume that they were using science and information from the medical community to make those conclusions, but it wasn't always the case. For marijuana, that was a hot topic. This was the late 60s. This was the time of Richard Nixon and, you know, the liberals and all the things that they're up to. And so there's the Schaefer Commission that's supposed to figure out, what do we do with marijuana? And they study it and they analyze it and they say, you know what? This is pretty much the same as alcohol. We ought to decriminalize this and we ought to just regulate it the same way as alcohol. Well, Nixon didn't like that idea at all because he wanted to stick it to the libs. And so he said, no, you know, they're going to hate this, so we're going to leave it on Schedule 1. And this is the only known picture of him making that announcement. And so he says, okay, no marijuana, it's on Schedule 1, you can't have it. Now, why did these states then turn around and begin adopting it? Trish mentioned California in 96 is the first one to sort of break through. Well, many reasons are it's a very popular product. People like it. It creates a wealth of economic growth for people at all different levels, and it delivers a host of medical benefits, which Trish talked about at length. And so we'll hit those with some slides to just kind of illustrate the kind of economic growth that you see in this space. It's remarkable. You don't see this really in any other industry out there right now. That line at the top is the illegal market, you know, which is in the $50 to $60 billion range. We're trying to pull that down as obviously as the legal market takes its place, the illicit market is going to have to come down. And so these projections are huge, you know, relative to other industries. You know, the National Football League's at $12 billion. Last year, legal recreational medical cannabis was 16 to 20 million. So much bigger than the NFL, which that's a pretty big thing. Craft beer is 27 billion. They say in a few years, the top line there, legal recreational medical cannabis will be bigger. Marijuana is wildly popular, particularly medical. 91% of people polled this year said, yeah, it ought to be legal for medical use. What are we talking about? Why wouldn't it be? Meaning you talk to a doctor, someone has made a medical conclusion that there's some situation, some reason that you should be allowed to do this. And I mean, I think the libertarians get on board and say, well, yeah, let's just get government out of our life. Everybody else says, you know, who are we to you know, have this sort of oversight of people? These are adults, and this is a relatively speaking benign type of substance. This is not heroin. You try it a couple times, you're right, you might be ruined. There's just not a history for that. So 60% of those 91% say, for those reasons that I just kind of alluded to, you know what, it ought to just be adult use. If you're an adult and you can make the decision to drink or smoke cigarettes, why are we going to say anything should be different as to marijuana? Here's the public opinion over time. And I've seen charts that go all the way back to the 70s, and then there's a real, you know, depression, you know, against it in the early 80s, with just say no and all that. But it's fairly steady, and it's always sort of moving upward. You know, regardless of your political stripes, there's just a reality to it. What are we worried about? Here's a little bit of science. I like this slide. This is the difference between a toxic dose, meaning something that would have, you know, severe harm on you, and the typical human intake. And so for alcohol, it's pretty small. You know, the amount you're going to take versus the amount that's going to cause you a problem is pretty small. For cannabis, it's gigantic. As Trish said, there's no way that you can overdose. In the history of the world, to my knowledge, there's no history of anyone consuming so much cannabis that their body just quit and died. And there's another slide for that point. You know, annually, no deaths from cannabis. Many deaths that can be linked to tobacco and alcohol by comparison. So those medical benefits Trish was talking about in much better detail and much more knowledgeably than I could. That translates into marijuana being used as an alternative medication in a lot of places, and the numbers are bearing this out. But healthcare spending goes down, and so this is among, you know, Medicare and Medicaid communities. They're showing a drop in the use of opioids, for example, in states, and that is a statistically significant amount of a difference between states with medical marijuana and those without. And keep in mind, this is a situation where people are saying, no, I'm going to pass on having the conventional medication that you may want to give me and that was paid for by Medicare or paid for by health insurance, and I'm going to dig in my pocket and pay for this alternative medication. And so the federal government agrees, and they know marijuana has fantastic medical benefits. They hold a patent since October of 2003. A federal agency has held a patent over certain aspects of substances within the cannabis plant, and it has licensed that patented information to a company in England called GW Pharmaceutical, I think, and they come up with this product, Epidiolex, which the FDA granted approval of. It's the first medication that's derived from marijuana or cannabis, and that was over 3 years ago. So wait, how's it still in Schedule 1, right? That doesn't seem to line up with everything. And so there are multiple ways scheduling on the Controlled Substances Act can be changed. It can be done by the executive branch. There have been 5 efforts to have that happen, and that hasn't happened. Congress at any time could just amend the law to change it. It hasn't happened. Why not? Politics, our favorite thing. The reason I think that there are probably so many problems out there. It is not politically expedient for a majority of Congress to vote in favor of changing the scheduling of marijuana, at least right now. Let's talk about Missouri's medical marijuana industry and some of those legal considerations. Here are some numbers, the information given out by DHSS. They provide this on a regular basis. 150,000 approved patients and caregivers. Agent IDs, that's something that someone must apply for in order to work for one of these facilities. And so by implication, perhaps as many as 5,100 jobs have been created now by this industry in the state of Missouri. Cumulative sales, $136 million through the end of last month. The Amendment 2 constitutional provision that brought us this industry includes certain rights and protections for patients. It doesn't do us much good if it brings a new industry and a new product and then people can't consume it because they're going to get arrested or they're going to lose their job. And so there are protections in terms of how much can be purchased. There are limits as well. Someone can't just sort of go into their own side business. You can't buy a bunch of it and start selling it to your neighbors who aren't patients, that type of thing. There are restrictions, but there are also protections. You cannot be subjected to civil or criminal liability merely by the fact that you're doing actions or behaviors that are protected and allowed under Amendment 2. Now, again, like alcohol, there's a need for protection for things like public consumption or intoxication, and actually to some degree that is permitted for alcohol. We're not there yet for marijuana. In essence, this is something that is done in private, and you cannot then subsequently engage in some activity that would put other people at risk or would involve negligence, and that certainly extends to doing your job, working or attempting to work. And that's an interesting confluence there. I've done a whole presentation just on the employment issues of when and how can employees consume medical marijuana, and the difference between consuming and when it shows up on a test. The test results can come back for days or weeks later since the last time that somebody consumed. So it's problematic. Again, I talked about some exemptions and protections. Patients are protected. Physicians like Trish are protected from participating in this industry by, being involved in a facility or issuing a physician certification to a patient. Likewise, I was happy to see that the amendment contains provisions protecting attorneys. If I'm helping my clients operate these facilities and maintain, regulatory compliance, I can't have my license disciplined for that. So when we talk about, facility residents and long-term care, nursing home facilities, things like that, it does get complicated because very often these are facilities that are accredited through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or they receive federal funding. In those situations, they're federally regulated, and since marijuana is still considered wildly illegal with no medical benefits under federal law, the answer would be, generally speaking, that it's a no. And I'll stop here and pause by saying I'm not legal counsel for anyone listening to this. You definitely would want to consult your own counsel on compliance with local state laws. I did make an inquiry with the Department of Health and Senior Services, which regulates the industry, and I would think also may or may not be the regulator for the nursing home, to ask, were they aware of any laws that have passed since Amendment 2 specific to this, and I was told that they were not aware of it. So it is a fuzzy area, as is often the case with a lot of issues in this industry. So a facility that says, all right, let's allow our patients to consume, or let's, in some way permit it, that could jeopardize their standing with the federal government. It could result in a loss of funding or the penalties. I have not and could not find, I didn't do an exhaustive search, but I couldn't find any instances of facilities suffering consequences, though, for making that choice. And I did find some articles. Somebody who's a nursing home attorney was writing an article talking about this and reported essentially the same. Didn't find any reported cases of facilities suffering adverse consequences. So in some other information I found out there just talked about, logically, you're really dealing with three options. The safest, the most conservative option would be to just say, nope, it's contraband. We're not going to allow our patients to take heroin, even though they may think that makes them feel better. So we're going to treat marijuana the exact same way. The other way is the kind of the opposite side of the equation. Say, all right, we're not involved. What you do and how you do it, just don't interfere with our facility's operations and don't do anything that shouldn't do. Obviously, again, you need to spell some of that out, what that's going to allow. And then the middle ground would be to permit it, but then take some kind of an active role in ensuring that the patients are complying with state law and ensuring that any patient who is someone who's consuming marijuana as a part of their daily life has the necessary patient certifications and that their card is updated and renewed on time and all of those other things. So a facility that chooses those options would just need to also have some common sense policies surrounding that. Secure storage. You don't want the employees in the facility to be able to steal from the patients, because in most cases you're not going to necessarily store it, even if you're having that ensuring compliance piece. You probably wouldn't want to take the additional step of saying, all right, let's keep it here and let's dispense it, because it's not a prescription medication. Again, I'm not sure what the best choice is on that one. Want to avoid, obviously, the patient sharing with other patients who aren't patients, or aren't, I should say, qualified patients holding medical marijuana patient cards. You got to determine permissible methods of administration. Maybe smoking marijuana in a facility wouldn't make a lot of sense for a lot of other residents, or maybe would have adverse reactions to that. Talk about how does it get into the facility. That's got to be the resident or their family or the caregivers handling that. And Trish talked at length about, drug interactions. That information needs to be known so medical staff can consider that. And then, the facility needs to think about protecting itself. If someone has, a bad drug interaction or something like that, they make a poor, choice, and now they're unhappy about it, they shouldn't be able to blame the facility. The federal government has, kind of consistent with the idea that there aren't cases out there, the federal government has, since about 2013, had a semi-formal, semi-informal truce that basically said, look, states, if you want to do this, we recognize the benefits, and we recognize the economic benefits, and we're just not going to get in the way, but we're not going to legalize it. We're not going to take it off Schedule 1. So there's this amendment that shows up in the omnibus budget bills, and we'll see if we can avoid another shutdown here in the coming weeks. But it's always in there, and every time when that portion of it comes up, it seems to get more and more votes. It's wildly supported, and it just says basically the money in this budget that goes to the Department of Justice cannot be used to prevent the implementation of any state laws authorizing the use, distribution, possession, or cultivation of medical marijuana. Now, it's specific to medical. This type of protection is not afforded to those states that have adopted adult use or recreational marijuana. There have been efforts to extend it to that, and those have not passed. But this one consistently passes. And so what does this mean? Well, don't prevent the implementation of state laws. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals was called upon to take up this issue in 2016 or 2018. And the defendants were some dispensary owners. Department of Justice was going after them. And DOJ said, well, wait a minute, read it. It says, we shall not prevent the implementation of state laws. So we can't go against the states. We can't go against California and prevent them from implementing their program. But that doesn't mean we can't go and get these dispensary owners, these storefronts that are selling marijuana to everybody. And the Ninth Circuit said, come on, give me a break. These state laws, like California's, identify conduct that individuals can engage in and that they won't be prosecuted for. So if the federal government is coming in behind them and prosecuting all those people, guess what? No one is going to take these licenses. No one is going to grow the marijuana. No one's going to open these shops. You're going to have the effect of preventing the states from implementing the laws. So yeah, no, you can't go after individuals, can't go after consumers, can't go after patients, can't go after dispensary owners, cultivation owners, unless they're not complying with the state's laws. So I've described it to my clients as sort of an umbrella or a shield. You must comply with the state's laws, and you have to fully comply with those laws and only do things that are permitted by those laws. If you sort of stick your head out from under that umbrella and you're trying something that's not covered by the state law, you could potentially have a big problem. And the other point that last bullet point makes is the Ninth Circuit made the point, said, look, this is not immunity. They're not saying you're not violating federal law. You're definitely violating federal law. You're just protected from the consequences of those violations for the now. There's a 5-year statute of limitations on the Controlled Substances Act for violations. So even if you were engaging in something now, if this Rohrabacher-Blumenauer amendment goes away, Department of Justice could theoretically come back and go after people and say, hey, 2 years ago when Rohrabacher was in effect, you were growing a bunch of marijuana, and so now we're going to prosecute you and put you in federal prison. The protection is really just safety in numbers kind of concept. At this point, they can't build enough prisons to hold all the people who are growing and operating and everything else. So I don't think it would come at it like that. Trish talked at length about the CBD. Just real quick on the legality aspects of CBD. It's legal to purchase it under federal and state law. There's something called the 2018 Farm Bill came out. Mitch McConnell is from Kentucky. Kentucky is big on growing hemp, not necessarily marijuana, but so he championed the cause to have that included and make CBD legal because relative to THC, it's fairly benign. Again, there are drug interactions, some of the things that Trish talked about, but it's permitted and it's available and you can find it in a lot of mainstream stores. You don't need a patient card. Its production is still regulated. Cultivators have to become licensed under state law. If the state says, yeah, we're okay with the industry, we just don't want to fool with regulating it. It's a hassle. The federal government will step in, and it has a regulatory framework through the Federal Department of Agriculture. But you got to be wary of the advertisements, and again, someone like Trish can speak authoritatively about the kind of medical benefits that are available. They do exist. It depends on the person. Everybody's reactions are going to be different to CBD and THC. But the FDA has said, look, CBD has been approved as a drug ingredient in only one thing, an Epidiolex product that I showed you a little earlier. It hasn't been approved to be included as a drug ingredient in anything else. And so technically these producers are violating FDA regulations by continuing to put out these products. It's not illegal for you to buy them, but the FDA has an issue with them. And the FTC has been really cracking down on some of these CBD manufacturers for their marketing. They're making some deceptive claims, sometimes ridiculous claims. Oh, make your cancer go away, this kind of thing. CBD doesn't do that. And as with any other kind of advertisement, your claims have to be substantiated. And when you talk about medical claims, they have to be substantiated by science. And you can't just make these assertions and then fool people into trying your products. So my last few slides are just a few illustrations of the industry. I don't know to what extent people, at the seminar have seen some of these types of facilities. This is just an example, a slide that Mocan Trade put on its website some time ago. Here's the interior. I mean, people can picture, if you haven't been in one of these, the old-timey, head shops, they were called, tobacco shops with records and Rastafarian type thing. No, these are fairly upscale. Some of my clients in Missouri, their places look like the inside of an Apple store. I mean, they are just pristine and beautiful, but they're clean and well-regulated, very, very secure. It's a serious operation. And the thing I really like about the industry is just kind of you see the entrepreneurship coming out, where people come up with all these different kinds of products, all these different sorts of delivery methods. Oh, you don't want to smoke? How about a sucker? All right. How about one of these little shots? Or maybe we've got some chewing gum, or, who doesn't like candy, right? So these are just examples. There seems to be a product for everybody's flavor and everybody's type, and a method to deliver it that won't cause you problems. So I think at this point, I will end my slides. And Jamie, if you want, we can try to take some questions if there are any.
Absolutely. I'd just like to thank you so much, Eric, for an incredibly interesting presentation. I was just remarking there to myself the comment about the Apple Store. Some of these facilities are really highbrow. They do not look anything like the taboo image might expect. And I was just thinking it is so interesting to be at this juncture with the intersection of public opinion, the legality, and the changing of cultural values. It wasn't so long ago that alcohol was prohibited in this country, and look at the journey now, and certainly it's came a long way from the prohibition era. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Yes, and great to see you again, Dr. Hurford. Thank you for an excellent presentation. If anyone has any questions, please do share in the Q&A or the chat, please. And we will be sharing the recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides with everyone.
Well, in the absence of a question from anybody else, can I ask a question of you, Trish?
Yes, sir.
I think for the benefit of the audience, and something that I have been asked before multiple times is, are there many doctors who will have sort of an interactive relationship with patients and talk to them about, well, try this method and try this dosage and try, you know, even to the point of maybe even the ratios of THC and CBD? Is that something that doctors go into, because you don't have the New England Journal of Medicine and you know, double-blind clinical studies to rely upon to really guide you?
There are some physicians. In general, in the state of Missouri, the education for students who've graduated from medical school or even students of pharmacy has been really very poor. And that's improving quite a bit. The pharmaceutical industry and pharmacy schools across the nation have really picked up the ball. They realize this isn't a plant and a treatment that won't go away. And education has improved. So you are probably more likely to get good feedback on products right now from pharmacists. In the state of Missouri, there are relatively few physicians who will spend that amount of time to discuss that unless they're your own treating physician. And some physicians, unfortunately, who are employed by certain hospital systems are prohibited from certifying or endorsing the use of cannabis. I do believe that will change. In the absence of your own personal physician, there are resources online, and there are great physician educators, as well as nurse educators for the type of cannabis products that might be good for a specific medical problem.
Excellent, thank you so much. We've had a question in from Catherine Flora. Does cannabis have an effect on general anesthesia?
It can potentiate the anesthetic effect. So this, if it's not asked by the anesthesiologist who goes to do your preoperative clearance, then it should be at least admitted in your medication list, in your medication profile.
Absolutely. We've got one from Head Valeri. What are training requirements for dispensary employees? Do dispensary employees have to undergo legal training and indeed any training about the understanding of the effect of cannabis on customers?
So Eric, this is probably a better question for you. There is no standardized requirement for the dispensaries, but Eric can go into more of the legal conditions there.
Sure. I would say that my advice to my clients is to train the dispensary employees to understand the product, to have some knowledge of what is out there as far as studies and information about the product and the industry and potential benefits that can be achieved. But it is all relatively anecdotal. And one of the things that as a dispensary operator, they need to be careful of is these folks are not medical professionals. They're not nurses. They do have some useful knowledge, and they can share, you know, stories and information. And there is an effort, I think, at times from different groups to try and accumulate a body of data to say this type of product delivered in this fashion seems to help a lot of people with back pain. But beyond that, no, I mean, it's not, you know, a medical situation like that. There's training on providing delivery method information. There's training on safety. There's training on, you know, to the extent there's food items or some of those kind of things, but not anything arising to the level of medical type training.
Thank you so much, Eric. If we have any more questions, please do send them in. We only have a couple of more minutes. I'm very grateful to you both, Dr. Hurford and Eric, for joining us this afternoon. We are indebted to you for your conversation and insights. It's such an interesting topic and journey, to see the journey that cannabis and CBD has taken just over the last few years, both as a commercial interest and the admittance that whilst some have placed a great deal of taboo on it for decades, it's so mainstream now in many regards, despite the legalities that might persist.
There was one question on the chat room regarding research from an independent third party that doesn't benefit financially. And there are independent researchers, but as with any product in the market, particularly pharmaceutical products, a lot of them have some financial backing that may bias the interpretation. I will share that there are plenty of good research protocols put into place by people who are independent and are not funded by the cannabis industry with good data. And those numbers and that amount of research will continue to improve.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hurford. If there are no more questions, I will thank you both kindly for presenting this afternoon, Dr. Patricia Hurford and Eric Walter, partner at Armstrong, Teasdale. And we are grateful to you both for your information, for your participation, and grateful to everyone for attending this afternoon. We will send out the recording and presentation slides within 24 hours. There will be a survey that will appear on screen very shortly. Please do share your feedback on your feedback from today, and we'll be grateful for that. Please do check in with us for future education webinars from VOYCE at our website, voicestl.org, and we look forward to being in touch with you again soon. But once again, thank you, Dr. Hurford and Eric Walter, and to all our attendees.
Thank you, everyone.